Welcome to another study of God's Word. We're studying the book of Matthew, the Gospel of Matthew, and we've been going through this for about a month now. We're picking up in chapter 13 this evening. So if it's your first time tuning in, I'd encourage you to go back and look at lesson 1, where we begin all the way back in chapter 1. We're walking through, we're trying to make connections, trying to understand the message of the book of Matthew. Now, in our last study, we looked at chapter 12, where Jesus was being accused by the by Pharisees and those who were trying to undermine his ministry. He shows in various ways that they are hypocritical in their responses. Tonight, we're looking at a number of parables in Matthew chapter 13. We're going to look at the parables themselves. We're going to look at some reasons that Jesus teaches in parables. And I think that those reasons are not disconnected from some of those accusations that have been made towards Jesus. And so we'll get into some of that as we go along in the lesson tonight. A couple of our members are with us here this evening, Justin Thomas and Kevin Moore. We appreciate them joining us. And of course, Luke Capps is with us as well, and we're thankful for him being here. Well, as we said, we open up chapter 13. And what we have is just a number of parables. So this is a very concentrated. A lot of the gospel writers do this. They group parables together. And this is certainly one of those occasions where Matthew is doing that. It starts out by saying, on the same day, Jesus went out of the house and sat by the sea. And great multitudes were gathered together to him, so that he got into a boat and sat. And the whole multitude stood on the shore. And then he spoke many things to them in parables, saying. And so then we have the first parable. The first parable is about a sower who went and sowed seed. And he sowed that seed into various types of soil. And of course, as when you would sow seed in various types of soil, you get various types of results. And so we have seed where there's just no result. We have seed where there's some result, and then we have seed where there's really good results. Luke, why don't you tell us about what those soils are and what we make of them, and tell us what they mean, because Jesus gives us some more instruction about this later on in the chapter.
Well, it's kind of hard for us to understand it as well as that generation in Jesus's day, because they were much more focused on agriculture and farming. But I think when Jesus explains a little bit what these soils mean, I think even if we don't have that extensive of a knowledge on it, he still makes it clear for what this is. So the first soil that he talks about the seed falling into is soil that falls, soil where the seed falls beside the road and by the wayside. In verse 4 it says, and then in verse 19, he says that the soil, what that soil is when anyone hears the word of the kingdom and does not understand it, the evil one comes and snatches away what has been sown in his heart. And so that is what that soil is, the one where they receive the word, but it doesn't really even get, past the surface, or it really doesn't get past the surface. And so it's taken away. And then that second soil is the rocky soil, where I think, we see in verses 5 through 6 where it says that when the sun had risen, after the seed had sprang up a little bit, in verse 5, the sun had risen, they were scorched, and because they had no root, they withered away. And that soil, he says, is like the person who ultimately there was no firm root, where the word had no firm root in the person. And so when affliction and persecution came, almost immediately that seed, that whatever was built there, withers away, whatever promise there was there away, as we see in verses 20 through 21. And then the third soil is the thorny soil, where this is represented as the faith, where there is something there. It does kind of get to the surface a little bit deeper, but when the worries of the world and the deceitfulness of wealth come in, as he says in verse 22, then it gets choked out. That faith that's there gets choked out. And I think it's interesting to note those two things, what Jesus says, the worry of the world and the deceitfulness of wealth. And then that fourth soil is the good soil, which is the man who hears the word and understands it. So not only does it reach the surface, but it goes deep and roots deep within the person. And the person after receiving that soil will bear fruit according to what he has received. And you see that in verse 23. And I can't help but remember when hearing about that good soil bearing fruit, what some of the teachings that John talks about, the fruits of repentance, and Jesus, even some of his teaching talking about fruits of people's works in so far in Matthew. But Stephen, you might have something to add to all that.
Yeah, so Luke's just taking us through those soils there. And Jesus, first of all, he tells the parable. And so he describes these soil types. And then his disciples ask him, why do you teach in parables? And he gives an answer. And then he comes back around and says, but as to this parable, and then he walks through there, you see a little bit later in the chapter, beginning in verse 18, he says, let me tell you what I mean by all of this. And so he goes into more detail. This is a rare occasion where Jesus sort of spells out every element. A lot of times it's left to us to spell out the elements of the parable. And so what Luke's just done for us is to combine those two sections. And so on the one hand, you've got the parable, and then on the other hand, you have it explained. So, seed sown, it hits the soil, and there are different responses. We're going to come back to that in just a moment, but I want to pause and look at that question that's asked. Why are you teaching in parables? That's the question that they ask of Jesus. What's his response, Kevin?
Well, the short answer is so the people who want to hear it will hear it, and the people who refuse to hear it won't hear it. The difference being one has an honest heart, and one in verse 15 has a heart that is waxed gross, and they have closed their own eyes. Back in chapter 11, Jesus said, I'm glad you've revealed to babes and kept it from the wise and the prudent. It's a matter of attitude. The people with the right heart will hear it, but the people with a wrong heart or a closed heart won't. Somebody coming up wanting to be intellectually stimulated by some great orator that he's heard that might be on par with his own intellect, so he's going to come listen to him. He's going to watch Jesus and walk away going, all he did was tell stories. I don't get that. And I'd like to contrast, if you don't mind, what is the opposite of speaking in parables? A lot of times, you see him speaking in parables, but you kind of wish that he would be a little bit more plain about just come out and say your truth. The Jews ask him in John 10:24, come out and tell us plainly if you're the Christ. And in that situation, Jesus said, look, I've already told you. There's many people, there's many things that Jesus can say that Jesus did say that were actually plain, and people still had trouble. Go sell what you have in Matthew 9. He didn't want it to mean that. I have the power to forgive sins in Matthew. The rich young man was not Matthew 19. And Jesus said, I have the power to forgive sins. He proved he had the power to forgive sins in Matthew 9. But that's not what the people wanted to hear. The people who aren't going to hear are the people like in John 7:24 that say, have any of the rulers or the Pharisees believed in him? Clearly, he's not worthy of our intellect. And those are the people who are going to miss it. And Jesus says, this is just what Isaiah said. People aren't going to hear it because they've closed their eyes, they've closed their ears, they've closed their heart. But your eyes are open. You're listening, and you're going to get it. And you're going to get it like people have been wanting to get it for thousands of years.
Yeah. Anything else there?
Nope.
Okay. I really like the idea of contrasting because it recalls to mind some of the hypocrisy back in chapter 11. Here John the Baptist comes this way, and you say this, I come this way, and you say this. And in other words, Jesus says, no matter how I come, you don't like it. And so I think the same thing in the parables. It's not like parables is the only way Jesus spoke. He did speak plainly, and they didn't like that either. And so, in one sense, no matter how you speak, people who don't want it won't get it. But I also think there is this added layer of nuance here, this added layer of a device that when you communicate, that people who want to distort and not get it, that's the same thing today. And the notion that attitude will affect your comprehension, that's kind of a scary thought, but it's a reality. I mean, just look around at anything that happens on our planet, and you can see how attitude affects people's processing of reality. Well, that's certainly the case with parables as well. People who want to misunderstand them will misunderstand them. Yeah, go ahead.
I'm sorry. I thought there was a gap. Also, if you notice, there's no middleman between Jesus' truth and the listener. He doesn't present his truth where the listener has to run to the Pharisees and say, what did he mean by that? Yeah. He doesn't have to run to the educational institution and say, what did he mean? He doesn't have to run to the keepers of knowledge to see what Jesus meant.
Right.
The message goes straight to the listener.
Yes. And also these messages are these messages are simple, and they're in terms of the everyday man. Everybody understands, as Luke said, maybe not us as much, but for them, everybody understands putting a seed in the ground and watching it come up, and they understand, the different places where you put the seed and the different results that you get. So absolutely, they're approachable. Well, coming back to that parable of the sower, I think there's an important thing for us to realize when we're reading through this parable, and that is who that instruction is for. And so as we look at any particular parable, there's multiple characters in each parable, and one of the things that we need to figure out is, who are we? Who are we supposed to be? Where do we fall in these parables? And so, Justin, where does Jesus point this instruction seemingly by what he says about application?
Well, he points it to everyone, really. More particularly, everyone's heart. I think Kevin's already hit on this quite a bit, but Jesus mentions in verse 15, the hearts of the people grow dull. And then later in that verse, he also mentions again their hearts. He says, lest they should understand with their hearts and turn so that I should heal them. The target of this instruction is really the people that he's talking to here, but us as well. And it's the target is our heart. As Kevin mentioned earlier, he talked about the heart of people. And if you read through the soils here that Luke pointed out for us, the way the soils fall, or the way the seed falls on the soil, is referencing the way the seed or the word may fall on people's hearts. And a lot of times we approach this parable from the standpoint of spreading the word to others and the word falling on their hearts, which I think is applicable, but we also need to approach it from the standpoint of what kind of heart do we have? What kind of soil do we have? Do we have the soil that is easily snatched away? Do we have the soil that is stony? Do we have the soil that no root can be put in, and therefore when tribulation comes, we stumble? Do we have the soil where it's good ground, we understand, and we can take that word, we can take that seed and bear fruit and produce good things? The thing is, we can't know anyone else's heart. Only God knows the heart. We can know our heart, and we can look at this and we can examine ourselves and find out what kind of soul, what kind of heart that we have. But going back to the analogy of the agriculture, one of the points that I think Jesus makes it in the agricultural part of it is that you see the result of the plant or flower or food, whatever's growing, come up out of the ground. But what you don't see is all the work that's already been done underneath the ground. And so part of that is something that we don't see as well. We see the after effects of the seed being planted, but we don't see what's going on underneath first. With some of these, with the soul or with the heart of people. And so going back to your original question, the target is just the heart of everyone, whether it's the people there that he's talking to, or whether it's us or anyone to come.
Yeah.
It's the heart of the people that he's talking to.
Yeah. And so while, as you said, there is some application to be made about teaching other people and planting seeds in other gardens, the idea here is weed your garden. Get the rocks out of your garden. And from the standpoint of figuring out what character we are, I think there's something to be said when we come to this parable and we all think we're the ones spreading the seed. We're the dirt. And we're the ones that need to figure out what's got to be done here on the receiving end before we can even talk about what to do on the giving end. How do you receive God's word? So appreciate that. There's some good observations there. Well, as we continue on past that parable, he says another parable is put forth to them, saying, the kingdom of heaven is like a man who sowed good seed in his field, but while men slept, his enemy came and sowed tares among the wheat and went his way. But when the grain had sprouted and produced a crop, then the tares also appeared. So the servants of the owner came and said to him, Sir, did you not sow good seed in your field? How then does it have tares? And he said to them, An enemy has done this. And the servants said to him, Do you want us then to go and gather them up? But he said, No, lest while you gather up the tares, you also uproot the wheat with them. Let both grow together until the harvest. And at the time of harvest, I will say to the reapers, First gather together the tares and bind them in bundles and burn them, but gather wheat into my barn. Well, Luke, this is another parable where Jesus circles back around and gives us an explanation. And what is his explanation of this particular parable? And what do each of the elements represent?
So after the disciples come to him and ask him to explain this parable, in verse 37, he explains it, and he says, The one who sows the good seed is the Son of Man, and the field is the world. And as for the good seed, these are the sons of the kingdom, and the tares are the sons of the evil one, and the enemy who sowed them is the devil, and the harvest is the end of the age, and the reapers are angels. And so I figured I would just go ahead and read through that because I would much rather Jesus do the explaining than me. But so there we have exactly what each element was. But in verse 40, he goes on to say, So just as the tares are gathered up and burned with fire, so shall it be at the end of the age. The Son of Man will send forth his angels, and they will gather out of his kingdom all stumbling blocks and those who commit lawlessness, and will throw them into the furnace of fire. In that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. So one thing that I think is interesting in this parable is that there's good seed that is put on soil, and the soil is producing something. It is in fact producing something, but it's producing both the wheat and the tares. And so I think it's interesting that even though it's bearing fruits, there's still some danger of being taken with the tares, because in verse 29, as you read, when they ask, should we uproot them, the man says, No, for while you are gathering up the tares, you may uproot the wheat with them. And so there is a danger of being mixed, in a sense, and taken with the tares. Maybe some practical application, we need to make sure that we continue to bear good fruit. Yeah. And not get too mixed in with the tares. Yeah,
that there's a distinction, absolutely. I think one of the keys there is that he says the field is the world. And one of the things that can happen as you're reading through, and I've heard this from multiple sources, as you're reading through the parable as it's being given, the kingdom of heaven is like this a field, a man who sowed. It's like a man who sowed seed in the field. People think that the kingdom is the field, And so what you have is wheat and tares. So, for instance, in the kingdom, in the church, and that Jesus's notion would be, don't do anything about that. Don't try to make any distinctions among wheat and tares. And that's not at all what Jesus says. He says there's going to be good in the kingdom, and then there's going to be those who are outside the kingdom. And so, sorry for that notification there. Then there are going to be those who are outside the kingdom, and there are going to be those in the world. And what he's saying is something, I think, similar to what happens when they come up to Samaria, and Samaria will not let Jesus pass through. And the disciples said, "Do you want us to call down fire?" And Jesus says, "Whoa, not yet. That's not now. I'm still trying to save these people, still trying to work with them, and I don't want to destroy the good with the bad." And so I think that's the world right now. Is there's a lot of tares in the world. And God says, I'm going to do everything I can to make sure I harvest as much good wheat as possible. And I'll make that separation at the end of all things, and not right now. Because what that looks like right now is everybody goes down. And he doesn't want his to go down. And so I think that's a distinction. God's the one who will separate the wheat and the tares in the world. And I think that's reflected in Paul's message in 1 Corinthians chapter 5, as we're seeing the separating of leaven, as he uses that illustration there. He says it's in the church. And he says, when you talk about people in the world who are like this, what have I got to do with that? That's God's business. God will separate those wheat and tares. But when there are tares among God's people, Paul says, no, we do separate that. We do weed that out. And so I think there's a distinction that needs to be made there. Well, he comes through and gives a series of parables here, a couple of short parables. The first one is that the kingdom of heaven is like a mustard seed. How so, Kevin?
Well, mustard seed is about 1 to 2 millimeters. It is tiny. He says, it is indeed the least of all seeds, but when it is grown, it is the greatest among herbs, and becometh a tree, so that the birds of the air come and lodge in the branches thereof. The mustard seed grows by its own nature. Seeds grow. It's what they do. It's what they are designed to do. And it grows into something that's millions of times its original size. God gives the increase. It's growing the way it was designed to, and it's growing into what it was designed to grow into. And it becomes a refuge for those who seek it for shelter.
Yeah, it's a really beautiful picture. I really like that. That's some great observations there. I like that it's doing what it's designed to do. So when the church grows, it's just flourishing as God created it to do so. Acts chapter 8, as we see the church being persecuted. How is it growing in the midst of this? That's what it's made to do. It's grow. So whether they are there in Jerusalem flourishing, they grow. When they are persecuted and scattered, they grow, because that's what the kingdom does. And then, of course, that beautiful observation of it providing refuge so the birds come and light on its branches. Then he says the kingdom of heaven is like leaven. How is that, Justin?
Well, I can't help but think 1 Corinthians 5. Paul mentions leaven. In that case, he's talking about corruption. Mm-hmm. In this case, it's completely different analogy. He's talking about the kingdom of heaven is like leaven. In both cases, though, what does leaven do? It spreads. And I find it interesting, and I may be looking too much into this. You can tell me if I am, but we've been talking about seeds so far and planting and growing those seeds. And then now we're talking about spreading, which I guess is still growing, but now we're talking about a little bit something different. The kingdom of heaven is like leaven, which a woman took and hid in 3 measures of meal till it was all leaven. Even if you have just a little bit of leaven, it's going to spread, and it's going to keep spreading. And so the kingdom of heaven is like that. You mentioned it a minute ago, is made to grow. It's made to spread. And how's it going to spread? It's going to be spread by the contacts that we make, or in this case, the audience that he's speaking to. The folks that are going out and talking and living a life of an example. It's through their influence, by the contacts that they make, and it's not what is expected. It's not what the Jews would have expected it to be. It's something a little bit different.
Yes. Yeah, and so as you point out, here's a positive usage of something that is most often used as a negative example, so that influence is generally going in the other direction, as 1 Corinthians 5 would be. But influence is not the problem. It's which direction the influence is going, and here he's pointing to the good influence. I would say the opposite is true of salt, that most of the time it's spoken of in a favorable way. Salt is a blessing and so forth. But when you salt a field, it's not a good thing. And so there's a way in which that could be used negatively and positively, and the same thing's true with leaven as it is here. And so our thoughts ought to be, we talk about the world's influence quite a bit, cultural influence. Christians ought to be influencing people around them. That there ought to be something attractive, something that brings people towards God, just as he talks about the light and the salt in Matthew chapter 5, that our actions, our behavior causes people to glorify our God who's in heaven. Well, skipping over then the explanation of the parable of the tares that he gives there beginning in verse 37. He comes back again to talk about the kingdom of heaven, this time being like a dragnet. And so, a treasure found in a field. I was skipping ahead there just a little bit. And so, Luke, how is the kingdom of heaven like a treasure found in a field?
Sorry, that was muted for a second.
Yeah.
In talking about the treasure hidden in the field, he says, which a man found and hid again, and from joy over it, he goes and sells all that he has and buys that field. Now, there's a couple interesting things about this. First of all, the man, when he found it, sold everything he had and bought the field with the treasure. I've heard someone say before, he used the money that he got from selling everything he had to buy that treasure. I don't know. But ultimately, what I do know is what this implies about the treasure that he found, that it's worth far more than what he lost. It's worth far more than what he gave. And especially in light of that treasure, it's worth the price to obtain it. And just the fact that he had to purchase it. It's not just something that he found and then took it. It's something that he found and then worked to get it, or went to, that he still had to buy, still had to purchase. And also thinking about the joy that comes when finding this treasure. Again, he's saying that this is compared to the kingdom of heaven. I think for us, it's kind of hard to think about rejoicing to be a part of a kingdom, especially for Americans. We don't think about a monarchy. We don't think about kingdoms in necessarily the best of lights. But when you think about David in his reign, especially after he had come into Israel, after Saul had been killed, the people loved David and they loved everything that he did, and they loved to be a part of that kingdom. When you come to that kingdom, that's a kingdom you want to be a part of, and that's a kingdom that you would rejoice to be a part of, because you see the king who is good and pure and righteous. And especially when you see the king of this kingdom, then you all the more perfect and all the more joyful to come to this kind of kingdom.
Yeah. And I think, going along with that, the pearl is used as an illustration next, in very similar language. A man seeking pearls found one pearl of great price and went and sold all he had and bought it. The idea that when you see the kingdom, that someone who who sees it sees value. I think sometimes we're not looking for the right things. Tom Hollies talks about sometimes we're not asking the right questions, and so of course we're not finding the right answers. The idea of someone who is a purveyor of pearls, someone who is a connoisseur, if you will, then he sees this pearl and he sells all the things he had, including presumably all the other pearls he had, so that he could buy this one pearl. I think of people who do not know, who are out in the world and they're looking for something. And those occasions where I've been able to sit down with someone who's never been acquainted with the kingdom at all, to go somewhere where they've never heard the stories that you and I, all of us sitting here, have heard from our youth. And they hear these stories for the first time. And they hear really and truly about Jesus, not just a name, but actually hear about Jesus for the first time. And I've seen tears shed and people seeing, this is true. I studied with a Hindu man who said, it feels like I've been hearing fairy tales my whole life, and now I've heard what those fairy tales are based on. In other words, this is the true thing. This is the real thing. And I think of that when I think of this man who's so used to looking at pearls, and then he sees this one and says, oh, this is not like the other pearls. This isn't like anything I've ever seen before. When we grow up with it, maybe we don't realize its value because we haven't seen all the other pitiful treasures in comparison. We're not used to the pitiful treasures in comparison, but we need to see its value. And so we want to be able to see the kingdom with that kind of splendor that's described here. Well, then he says it's like a dragnet cast into the sea and gathered some of every kind. Kevin, what's the similarity of a dragnet and the kingdom?
Well, it's not just the dragnet, it's the sea, it's the fish, it's the ones doing the casting and the ones doing the separating. It was cast in the sea, gathered of every kind, which when it was full, they drew to shore and sat down and gathered the good into vessels, but cast the bad away. So it shall be at the end of the world, the angels shall come forth and sever the wicked from among the just, and shall cast them into the furnace of fire. There shall be wailing and gnashing of teeth. The net was cast into the sea. If you'll give me a second to look at the opposite of a net, what's the difference between a net and a spear or a hook? A spear seeks for one at a time. A hook, you look for one at a time. The net gathers all. So the kingdom is trying to gather all. It is open to all kind of fish in the sea, all kind of men in the earth. The opportunity is available to all to be caught by the kingdom. Matthew 11, Jesus said, come unto me all ye that labor. But the net, if you notice, is not in the water forever. Verse 48, when it was full, they drew it to shore. There is going to be a time when they draw it in. It's not going to be there forever. And that time is inevitable. There will be a time when it comes to harvest. It was brought to a place of judgment where the good fish and the bad fish were separated. Notice that there were good and bad fish. I've seen people say that everybody is going to be in the kingdom. This is clear that there are going to be some who are cast away. The net was cast into the sea to get a particular kind of fish, not just any fish. And the fisher was looking to gather together the good fish, men with good hearts, like Matthew 6, the pure in spirit, the pure in heart, the poor in spirit, the meek, merciful, among others. Matthew 7:21, he's looking for hearts that will do the will of the Father. Matthew 11 again, those who are willing to take my yoke upon them. So the good fish are gathered together and the bad fish are cast away. But notice he doesn't just stop at saying, oh, he just separated the good and bad fish. He could have stopped there and the point would have still been clear. But he dwells on the casting the bad away. we see that not only that there are bad fish, we see who separated them. It's the fisher that separated them. And we see what will be done with them. He goes more than just saying they're discarded. The end result of the bad fish is not oblivion. It's not like, okay, they're gone and they don't have to, they just don't exist anymore. They're out of the picture. No, it's very specific. There is a fire with anguish and wailing. And notice it's verse 48. It's not the good fish who are sending the bad fish to the furnace. It's the ones who cast the net. So there will be anguish and wailing and gnashing of teeth.
Yeah, and that's not an infrequent part of these parables. As we look at the tares, and here as we look at the seed, that the judgment is part of the pictures of the kingdom pretty frequently. So as much as we talk about the value of the kingdom, and I really appreciate the bringing out the openness, I'm trying to bring all men unto me, but there will be that separating point. And so some very good observations there. He follows that up with a question. It says in verse 51, Jesus said to them, "Have you understood all these things?" And they said to him, "Yes, Lord," which is interesting because a lot of times they seem to say, "We have no idea what you're talking about," or express that in some way. But this time they say yes. And he says then, "Therefore every scribe instructed concerning the kingdom of heaven is like" what, Justin?
Mine says it's like a householder who brings out of his treasure things new and old. Now that they have said, yes, we understand, Jesus says, okay, you have a responsibility. The idea of a householder is a responsibility. Someone who has to take care of a house, uphold a house, but then also he brings out the treasure things old and new. And I think this references the folks that are, it says a scribe, which would be a teacher of the law. Someone that's a teacher of the law that becomes a follower of the kingdom of God is going to use both the things that he's known for and the things that he learns to teach and to preach and to be an example of. And so I think that's the point Jesus is making here is you need to use all of your knowledge, both the old and the new, in whatever way you can in preaching and teaching.
Yeah, and from a practical standpoint, looking at when Jesus is speaking, what would be the old knowledge that they would have?
It's what they had right then.
Yeah, which would be the Old Testament.
Old Testament.
And then what is Jesus adding? Well, it would be elements of the New Testament. And so I think that's a thing that we need to be cognizant of is that we're being called. We're trained in the kingdom, which means we ought to be finding the old things and the new. Now, in a sense, they're all old to us. Even the new things are now 2,000 years old. But that idea of when we separate the Old Testament and put it into a category of now not being so useful, that's not what Jesus does. He says, go find the treasures. They're both there and they're here. And we ought to be looking for those treasures everywhere and using those treasures everywhere in order to teach, as you said, that's what this person's job is. They're instructors in the kingdom. All right. Well, as we finish up these parables, it says, "Now it came to pass, when Jesus had finished these parables, that he departed from there. And when he had come to his own country, he taught them in their synagogue, so that they were astonished, and said, 'Where did this man get his wisdom and these mighty works?' And they began to ask some questions, make some observations, and come to a very pointed reaction. What is their reaction, Luke?
So at the beginning of verse 57, it says, as he was teaching these things and doing these things, they took offense at him. And Jesus says in response to this, said to them, "A prophet is not without honor except in his hometown and in his own household." First of all, I think we know that Jesus lived a perfect life. And even in his hometown, where I grew up, people would look at me today and they might think, well, I know that he wasn't always like this. He has had some failures in his life. For Jesus, they couldn't have any situation where they said, I've seen the failures in his life and I can't believe that he's talking like this. I mean, I do think that we should note that when we think about this. Just, yes, this was his hometown, and I think that this is very often the case for many people who come to their hometown or come back home in a sense. But ultimately, when it comes to Jesus, I mean, he was perfect. And so even if there was some personal, even if they took offense just because they did know him or had seen him grow up, they didn't have any knowledge or evidence that should suggest that they should take offense at him. But also, why did he not perform many miracles there? In verse 58, it says he didn't do many miracles there because of their unbelief. And I think that this kind of has some application for us today, because this shows us that even though there were miracles, the miracles weren't enough to convert some of these people. Some of these people looked at it and were offended. And I think we see that today. We have plenty of evidence that some of these miracles by Jesus occurred. Plenty of eyewitness accounts where it proves that these things occurred, but that's not enough for people today. But that's always been the case, even in Jesus's time, who saw it. It wasn't enough even for those people. And so when it comes to these miracles, not everyone is converted by these things because they first start off offended by it, or maybe have a hardened heart when they come to it.
Yeah, and I think to that point of their unbelief, it really highlights the purpose of the miracles. If you think Jesus performs miracles only because people benefited from them, because people would benefit from them, are we thinking that then that Nazareth couldn't benefit from Jesus' miracles? Well, not in the way that they needed to benefit, because primarily the way people need to benefit is to believe in Jesus. And when Jesus sees that that will not be accomplished, that his purpose will not be accomplished, then he doesn't perform the miracles. And so, you get a very sharp, really, I think, highlighting of the purpose of Jesus' miracles when it says if they don't believe, Jesus just says, well, I'm just not doing any. Because that's the whole point. That is the whole point, is to get people to believe. I really appreciate you highlighting that point of this being no excuse for the people in Jesus' hometown. It is a generally true thing. Jesus is saying a generally true thing. And I think in one sense, there is some almost sympathy in saying this is the way it is. When you grow up in a certain place, people will not listen to you. Dave Ramsey says, don't ever try to give financial advice to somebody who changed your diapers. And it's the idea of people don't want to listen to a little kid that's who they picture, a little kid. I do think that does not have to be the case. And I think that it didn't have to be the case here. I think that is no excuse. And I think your point is very valid, that even today, when we do make mistakes, if somebody's presenting truth, then it shouldn't matter what you thought of them at a younger age. But beyond that, here is Jesus. And there is no cause for that disrespect. They cannot look back at the faults of this young man. What they do, I think, is rooted in self-pride. And it is a pride of, he's just one of us. Who is he to tell us what we're supposed to be doing? But he wasn't just one of them. He did grow up among them, but they will not hear him because of their pride. Well, we see additionally in Luke's account that one of the things that his hometown wanted to do is throw him off a cliff. And so their reactions were even violent at times. As we come into chapter 14 now, one of the things that we see is that violence was not only turned towards Jesus, but John the Baptist. When we left off, John the Baptist was in prison. And as we begin chapter 14 in our next study, we're going to see what that prison resulted in. And so we hope that you'll join us for that study. We appreciate your joining us for this study and hope that these thoughts are helpful. I really appreciate Kevin and Justin and your input in this study this evening. Of course, we always appreciate your input as well. We hope that you'll continue to join us. Starting next week, our midweek study will be live, and so then only our weekend studies will be pre-recorded going forward. I think that's right. I'll update if that's different. But we invite you to tune in. We will send out notifications for the live classes and invite you to continue to study along with us through the book of Matthew. Thanks for joining us. Thank you, guys, and we'll hope to see you again in our next class.